Hello everyone, my name is Mrs. Anthony and I teach 5th grade at Pass Road Elementary in Gulfport School District, and today we are going to learn about friction. So the standard that we will be focusing on says that we will design a system to increase the effects of friction on the motion of an object. Our goal is to understand friction and how we can increase its effects. And similarly, our essential question is how can friction be increased? So we are all about increasing friction today. But first, we have to understand what friction actually is. So let's watch a quick video and hopefully that'll help us out.
How do things move in real life? Say a ball is moving on a flat ground and there's no external force acting on it. Will the ball eventually come to a halt? Yes, it will. Have you ever wondered why? Say you're skating on an ice rink and your friend is skating on the road. Whose movement do you think will be smoother? Definitely yours. When you hold a bottle in your hand, why doesn't it just slip through and fall? Sometimes when you're walking around in a mall, do you remember seeing a caution sign to warn you about the floor being wet? What explains all this? The answer is friction. The reason why the ball eventually comes to a halt is because of the force of friction. The reason why skating on an ice rink is easier because the force of friction is lesser there. The bottle doesn't slip through because the force of friction between your hand and the bottle doesn't allow it to do so. If the floor is wet, the friction offered by it reduces and there are chances that you might slip and fall. So what is this friction we're talking about? It's quite easy to understand its concept. Friction is nothing but a force. It is the force exerted by a surface where an object moves across it. In the first case, when the ball is moving in this direction, the force of friction is acting in the opposite direction. The force of friction offered by the ice rink floor is lesser than the force of friction offered by the road. Hence, skating on the ice rink is easier and seems effortless. The bottle does not slip down because the surface of your hand offers a friction in the upward direction. And in the case of the floor in the mall, the soapy water reduces the friction offered by the floor. In the coming lessons, we'll learn a lot more about friction. We'll see the factors affecting friction. We'll understand if friction helps us in our everyday life or not. And we will also cover the different types of friction.
Alright, so now we know that friction is a force that decreases and eventually stops motion. So now we know that we're going to be looking at how to increase friction. So we're really trying to stop some type of movement. But before we do that, let's dig a little bit deeper and look at some vocabulary and do some practicing with this whole concept of friction. So we have friction and motion. So first, vocabulary. It says drag the blue boxes into the correct category. Well, again, I know that friction wants to stop movement or motion. So let's think about that as we look at each of these boxes. When an object is not sitting still. So I know that if something is not sitting still, it must be moving, which is motion. So I'm going to drag that here. I hope you agree. A force that slows down a moving object. We know that that is force. We just learned about that. Decreases as motion increases. So as things are going faster and moving more, the friction must be decreasing. So we're going to move that over to friction. And finally, this increases as friction decreases. That is motion. Think about the example of being on ice skates. When there is less friction, you're probably going to skate a little bit or maybe a lot faster than someone who is on a surface that's causing a lot more friction. So as motion increases, friction decreases. Let's look at our next slide. It says drag the blue boxes into the correct category below to answer the question. So I have what is friction, where is friction, and how much friction. Okay, so what, where, and how much. Let's check it out. Located between all objects that are touching and are moving or trying to move. Well, located, that keyword kind of tells me we're talking about where. So where's friction? It's located between all objects that are touching and moving or trying to move. So as I rub my hands together, in between my hands, friction is located. All right. The amount depends on an object's material and size of contact area. That must be talking about how much. The key word in this one is amount. The amount depends on an object's material and size of contact area. So again, think about a huge rocky street versus a smooth surface. Which one is going to be easier to skate on? The smooth surface, because the contact area has less friction. And finally, there are no choices left. A force that resists motion between objects that are touching, we know that is friction. Next slide. It says the green boxes contain facts about friction. Drag it to the images that they describe. Objects rubbing together on a rougher surface makes more friction. Okay, so being on a rough surface causing more friction. Then we have objects rubbing together on a smoother surface making less friction. So I know that less friction means more movement. So a smooth surface. So typically slides, hopefully if it's comfortable, is a smooth surface. So we're going to put that there. Then we have skates. When you go, if you've ever been to a skating rink, you'll notice that the rink is very, very smooth to allow for less friction so you can move faster. Then here we have someone who is having a wonderful time on a sled. Again, that slippery snow sometimes has barely any friction. It can be very slippery sometimes, but the surface is a lot more smooth. So those are all of our choices for less friction. Now let's look at our three that have more friction. So here we have this beautiful car. When you are driving a car, or most of you guys riding in a car, the roads, they're hopefully smooth, but they're not too smooth so that it's easy for cars to slow down and so that we don't have a lot of accidents. So we want a little more friction on the road. Then we have the bottom of your shoe, or of a shoe. Hopefully the bottom of your shoe has a good bit of friction, or else you will be slipping and sliding all over the place, and we don't want that. And finally, you have riding your bike. Typically, when you're riding the bike, there is friction between the ground and your tires. Again, that's keeping you from speeding off over the place. That could be very dangerous. So luckily, we have more friction in these situations. Our next slide, more or less. So look at the images. Do they show more friction or less friction? So first we have someone who looks like they may be ice skating. I'm going to say less friction here, because when you are ice skating, you're able to move. First of all, you're on a smoother surface and you're able to move a lot more quickly, a lot more freely. So that is less friction. Then we have a tire. Remember what I stated on that last slide. Tires, between the tire and the road, there's friction so that cars aren't speeding all over the place. That will be, again, very dangerous. So I'm going to go with more friction. And then we have someone here who is skiing. Remember I talked about that slippery snow? You want less friction when you're trying to ski because you want to be able to move quickly and efficiently. So that is, again, less friction. we will go to the next slide. We're going to skip one. Now we're talking about air resistance. Air resistance, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but air resistance is friction in the air. Read the sentence above. What happens to the ski jumper and the parachute because of air resistance? So, when you, hopefully, I've never done this. I don't know if you guys, maybe some of y'all have, maybe y'all are adventurous, but if you have ever went skydiving or something of that nature, or if you've seen someone go skydiving and they have these parachutes, what does the parachute help you to do? It slows you down, and it increases the friction between the air and the parachute so that you don't go flying into the ground. So very luckily in these situations we have friction to help us slow down and decrease how quickly we're moving to the ground. So air resistance is extremely important. Increase of motion. As motion increases, friction decreases. Read the sentence above and explain how this statement is true. So look at our friend here. He is sliding down. Looks like he's having a wonderful time, and he's moving extremely quickly, I can assume. That is because there is less friction. Remember, friction stops you from moving. Think about it as being that force that's kind of holding you back. So if he's moving quicker, he's quickly increasing his motion, that means that there is less holding him back. So the friction has decreased. And that is our final slide. So let's go back, and now we're going to get ready to talk a little bit more about some air resistance, but we have a little more to cover before that. So stick with me. So our whole goal today, we want to work on designing a vessel that increases friction. We know that friction stops motion, or it decreases motion. So we want to design something that decreases motion or increases friction. So our scenario here, we have Ed the egg, and he lives at the top of the slide on the playground here at PRE. Now, he needs to safely get to the bottom to find his friends. But if you know anything about eggs, they can be very delicate. So, he can't roll or jump because he might break and crack. We don't want that for Mr. Ed. So, we need to think about how we can plan to design a system to safely get him down using friction. First, let's consider the types of friction and determine which might be best to help Mr. Ed in this sticky situation. So we're going to watch a quick video on the different types of friction.
If you and a friend were playing catch outside and you threw the ball over your friend's head, would the ball keep rolling forever once it hit the ground? Of course not. The ball would come to a complete stop after rolling a few feet on the grass. Why do you think this is? What is it about the interaction between the ball and the grass that causes the ball's motion to stop? The answer is friction. Friction is the force created when two objects rub against each other. This force applies to all objects. Friction always acts in the opposite direction of an object's motion. There is friction between your jacket and your t-shirt. There is friction between an airplane and the air through which it flies. There is even friction between your skin and the water in the ocean when you go swimming. Friction can be broken down into three specific categories: sliding friction, rolling friction, and fluid friction. Sliding friction occurs when two solid surfaces slide over each other. Sledding illustrates this type of friction perfectly. When you sled down a hill covered in snow, the solid bottom of the sled slides across the solid packed snow. Another example of sliding friction is built into the word itself, a slide. When you go down a slide, the solid of your body moves across the plastic or metal material of the slide. The second type of friction is rolling friction. Rolling friction occurs when an object rolls across a surface. The opening example of a ball dropped on the ground is an example of rolling friction. A bicycle is another great example of rolling friction. Imagine you are cycling down a street. If you stop pedaling and just coast, your bicycle's wheels will eventually roll to a stop. Without more pedaling, the friction of the wheels against the ground will stop the bicycle's motion. The final type of friction is fluid friction. Fluid friction occurs when a solid object moves through a fluid or a gas. Have you ever had to walk home in a storm? The strong winds likely made it difficult for you to move forward. When you are outside in a storm, the fluid friction between you and the air is increased. A swimming pool is another great place to study fluid friction. When you are in a pool, there is constant friction between your body and the water. Because the force of the friction slows you down, you have to paddle constantly. If no friction were present, you could glide all the way across the pool with one stroke. All three types of friction act in the opposite direction of an object's motion. However, each type differs in how the friction is created.
Okay, so we've looked at 3 different types of friction: sliding friction, rolling friction, and fluid friction. But which would be best for Mr. Ed the Egg? Because again, eggs can be very delicate, and we would hate for him to crack on his way down the playground slide. So I think back to sliding friction. Not so much. Think about the examples of sliding friction and rolling friction from the video. We want to be very careful because again, Mr. Ed is very delicate, but I'm thinking that the best type of friction to use may be fluid friction. Now, fluid friction can be a little tricky when you're thinking back to the definition, because when you think of fluid, you think about water. And water is involved, but so is gas. And if you know anything about gas and the atmosphere around us, you know that oxygen or air is a gas. So think back to our slides when we did a little more investigating. Think about that example of the parachute that we talked about and how it increased air resistance. Keep that on your brain as we go. So again, we want to use fluid friction, specifically that air resistance that I was talking about. Air resistance is the frictional force that air exerts against a moving object. As an object moves, air resistance slows it down. So we need to transport Mr. Ed through the air, but we want something to slow it down because we can't just throw Mr. Ed through the air. No, we need a specific vessel, a specific tool to get him down there safely. So, what is used to slow things down when they are falling through the air? Think back to that example during our investigation. Parachutes. Now, of course, Mr. Ed the Egg isn't as big as a human, so he may not need a huge real parachute, but maybe we can make one that is perfect for his size. So we need to design him some type of parachute or maybe even a hot air balloon that uses air resistance to help him slowly and safely get to the ground. So we need 2 main things. We need something to hold Mr. Ed and keep him secure, and we also need something that will apply a great amount of air resistance. So those 2 main components are simply a cup and a plastic bag. And I'm sure you have these 2 things at home with you. If you're like me and you save all your plastic bags from the grocery store, you have some in your cabinet, I'm sure. So a plastic cup, a plastic bag, we can use these 2 things to safely get Mr. Ed to the ground. Now, of course, you'll need some small things like glue, maybe some string, maybe even some cotton or something to keep Mr. Ed comfy in his little transport system. But again, these are simple things that many of you guys probably have at home to build Mr. Ed a safe vessel to get him down that slide. Because again, we do not want Mr. Ed the egg to crack. So, to recap, friction is a force that slows down motion. It slows down until it stops. There are different types of friction that all depend on the motion that is occurring. And air resistance is what we would use to safely transport Mr. Ed through the design of a parachute. Of course, fit custom for his little eggy needs. So, thank you guys for watching. Go out there and test that experiment. Work on using those simple tools to design a vessel and see if you can safely transport your own version of Mr. Ed. I surely hope you enjoyed today's lesson. I hope to see some of your experiments and hopefully they're successful. I will see you all next time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.